So one more lesson on theory before we get into some real necessary assumption questions. In the previous lesson, I mentioned that the relationship between a necessary assumption and the argument is this, right? If the argument were to run, meaning let's presume that the premise does in fact support the conclusion. If that were true, then your necessary assumption answer choice has to be true. From that, we derived a method of teasing out correct answer choices. We say, well, hey, if that's the case, then negating the necessary assumption should produce a broken argument, right? An argument that's fallen apart. In other words, an argument where the premises being true can no longer support the conclusion. So that's what I want to talk about here, how to utilize this method, because in practice, lots of students have trouble with this element, right? With negating a claim. And the difficulty comes from the type of claim. Now, in theory, it's easy to negate a claim. If I tell you claim is X, you just say, okay, not X. That's it. Right? The difficulty, of course, is when the claim X is grammatically convoluted. And yeah, we've seen lessons previously on grammatical convolution, but here I just want to focus on one type of statement that's difficult to negate, and that's the conditional statement, right? In other words, statements like this, these are conditional statements. Here I'll keep it straightforward and simple for now. I'll just say the conditional statement is A arrow B, right? What is the negation of A arrow B? You have to know this because conditional claims appear with surprising frequency in necessary assumption answer choices. And the reason for that, I'm sure, is because LSAT writers know that it's difficult to negate conditional claims, right? So look, if you think the negation of this claim is this, that's wrong. You need to pay attention. If you think the negation of this is this, that's also wrong. You also need to pay attention. The surest way to not make an error when you're negating conditional claims is just to add the phrase, it's not the case that, in front of the claim. Okay, if you do this, you will never make an error. In fact, this extends beyond conditional claims. If you add this clause, this phrase in front of any claim, conditional or otherwise, you're never going to make a mistake. You will always end up with the negation, the correct negation. The drawback of this method is that if you weren't already clear on what this statement meant, this is just going to confuse you even more, right? So there, I think, is the heart of the issue. You have to understand what conditional statements mean. When we say A arrow B, we are saying there's a relationship between this element and this element, and the relationship is that of sufficiency and necessity. A is sufficient for B, which is just another way of saying B is necessary for A. If you are negating that claim, you are denying that relationship. You're saying no to the arrow. That's what you're saying no to. Not to A, not to B. You're saying no to the relationship as represented by this arrow. So where the arrow said A is sufficient for B, the negation of the arrow would say no, A is no longer sufficient for B, or in other words, B is no longer necessary for A. How do you represent that? Easiest, simplest way to represent that is like this. You keep A the same, right? You keep the sufficient condition the same. You change the arrow to an and then you slap a negation on what used to be the necessary condition. A and not B. Right? Think about that for a second. Why is this equivalent to it's not the case that A arrow B? Why? Because of what it meant to say that A arrow B in the first place. If truly it's not the case that A is sufficient for B, well, then what that means is you can have A and not B, right? Because A is not sufficient for B. That's how you get to have A and not B. Or if you want to look at it from the necessary conditions perspective, that's fine too. Right? Originally, we were saying, oh yeah, B is necessary for A. And then we said, well, hold on, let's negate that. So it's not the case that B is necessary for A. Okay, that means you cannot have B because it's not necessary and still have A. So when you encounter an answer choice, a necessary assumption, and you're asking yourself, is this really a necessary assumption? And the answer choice turns out to be a conditional answer choice. Well, what you can do is you can slap a negation on it, right? Negate the answer choice, see if it tears the argument apart. And the way to negate a conditional claim is by turning it into a claim like this, right? Whereas the original was A arrow B, the negative version is A and not B.